Well, good evening. It's about 5 minutes after the stated starting time, but that's not too bad, even for New York. I'm Bob Pollack. I'm the professor of biological sciences at Columbia University, who also runs the Center for the Study of Science and Religion, a center embedded within the Earth Institute, of which Jeffrey Sachs is the director. And I wish to make a very brief introduction of both Professor Sachs and Professor Wilson, who will then make their own 15-minute ruminations and statements of the issue of the evening. I will then join them in a discussion based on what they say, and then after some medium amount of time, we will break for questions from the audience. At the end of this event, Professor Wilson's new book, The Creation, will be available for sale outside to my right, your left. Now, Jeff Sachs and E.O. Wilson. There are four ways I thought of to introduce them. The classic way, which is the biography way, is the simplest. E.O. Wilson has a Ph.D. from the Harvard, which he earned in 1955. That is, by my calculation, 51 years ago. He has been at Harvard on the faculty for 49 of those years, where he's now Pellegrino Professor of University Professor Emeritus. He has 2 Pulitzer Prizes, the National Medal of Science, and is the author of the most beautiful book in science I know, The Ants, with Bill Dubler. He is as well the creator of the idea of genetic determination well before the Human Genome Project, not the creator of it, but I would say the best articulator of its benefits and risks in the book Sociobiology. In the topic sociobiology. Jeff Sachs is the director of the Earth Institute here. He's the Quetelet Professor of Sustainable Development and Professor of Health Policy and Management at Columbia, and the director of the UN's Millennium Project and advisor to Secretary General Annan on Millennium Development Goals. He has, I would say, been the most articulate, public, successful personage of any nation in any title to raise the consciousness of the entire planet on the matter of the necessity of environmental sustainability and on the matter of the necessity of ameliorating the suffering of the planet's billion least advantaged people. That would be the regular introduction, and it's not 5 minutes. What I also wanted to say is that they are connected personally. Jeff Sachs was a junior colleague of Professor Wilson, and before that, he was a student. Well, Wilson was a faculty member. I asked Jeff, and he said he never took a course with Wilson, but Wilson was his intellectual mentor in many ways, nevertheless. That is, to me, probably the most deep connection one can have in intellectual terms, is to be linked through one's relationship by ideas. The factual connection here is that in the last 200 years, as many of you know, but some of you wish not to know, our species has put itself and the living world of the big social creatures entirely at risk, which is a crisis for both science and religion, which the three of us in our different ways hope to address. Fourth way is the moral link. At this time, I think there are 2 symmetric, templated errors amidst all of us. The religion that says, don't bother me with that problem, I'm saved, and the science that says, don't bother me with that problem, I'm busy. We are, I hope, 3 people who are certain that our salvation in this world requires that we not be too busy to teach the facts and the meaning of our current global plight. That's my introduction. Professor Wilson will go first.
Thank you very much, and I must say, to be considered by anyone, but especially by him as a mentor, is the greatest honor I could hope for. So well, I'm very happy to be here with him. Our interests are actually so closely intertwined, despite their different provenances from economics and mine from biology, as to nowadays, in face of the pressing world problems you just mentioned, Bob, simply continuum of issues, of challenges, of moral implications. We have to somehow find simultaneously a solution to the world's great poverty problems, of which Jeffrey has which he has addressed with such penetration and spoken about so eloquently, on the one side, and on the other side, we somehow have to find a way to save the natural environment. And by natural environment, I don't mean rock and ice environments, beautiful headlands of islands and things like that. I mean the living environment. I mean the tens of millions of species that inhabit this planet with us, and they have to put together a plan that allows us to set it into as much equilibrium as possible, because without a healthy, nurturing, stable environment, the people of the world, and that includes us, dear friends, up here in the comfortable great city, the prospects for an indefinitely stable world are very dim. It's been estimated, it was done in 1997 by a team of economists and biologists, that the services, if you insist on putting a bottom line on it all, the services given humanity by the natural world, by that I mean, outside of our livestock and our agricultural fields, is services in water purification, in water retention, and automatic even distribution in the geologically ancient ways of pollination, of soil restoration, of purification and maintenance of the atmosphere itself. If you want to try to put a price tag on it, they estimated $30 trillion. That's with a T. And that is approximately equal, at least at that time, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Jeff, but it's approximately equal to the gross world product. In other words, what nature was giving us at that time and continues to give us scot-free is roughly equal to what we ourselves produce. In brief, the condition of the living world, biodiversity, now I would like to call it more broadly to include a religious audience, the creation, can be summarized as follows. In the last several decades, our technology, the technology of science, in exploring the biosphere, has discovered that this razor-thin membrane of life plastered onto the surface of the planet, so thin it cannot be seen with unaided vision from an orbiting shuttle sidewise. I know that because I asked an astronaut. Is far richer than had been imagined before. In other words, we're discovering entire new forms of life, including even one, the so-called slimes or subterranean lithoautotrophic microbial ecosystems. And I understand, Professor Pollack, that will be on the exam. Which is...
Why else would I be taking notes?
Oh, yes, of course. I don't see anybody else doing that. It starts, bacteria, microscopic fungi, and maybe so other things. Starts below our feet and goes down at least 2 miles of completely unexplored ring of life beneath us. But we're discovering then an amazing new thing every year. We only know, perhaps at a wild guess, 10% of the species on Earth. So we have to get busy with a program of exploration, and particularly urgent because we know from the groups that are well studied, like birds and flowering plants, from which we can make estimates and then extrapolate them, that life, the diversity of life, the species and the ecosystems they compose are vanishing at an accelerating rate. So much so, again, quoting recent studies, that unabated human activities, including climate change, degradation of natural environments, and unproductive use of soils and so on, continued, unabated, will result in the extinction or the pushing to the brink of extinction of roughly half the species of plants and animals on Earth. That includes all those unknown ones. And climate change alone, if left unabated, without correctional procedures like corridor reserves and so on included, could eliminate 1/4 of the known species of plants and animals in the next 50 years. So these are the problems that face us, and I'm closing in on the end of my 15 minutes here. And I want to leave open things for more open discussion, but trust me when I tell you that this is happening. This is actually it's actually a part of the environmental drama unfolding that is not even questioned by the White House. And this is
even
going
that?
this is, in other words, it is solid science and not really seriously questioned. It is really happening. And that unless we can find the solution, and as I started this brief statement with, that solution emphatically has to include improving the quality of life of the 80% of people in the developing countries, and within that, very large number of people into the hundreds of thousands who live in absolute poverty. So these things have to be addressed. Otherwise, the loss for generations to come, in the case of the living environment, for centuries, for millennia to come, since has taken in the past for big extinction spasm to be repaired by evolution, it takes 5 to 10 million years. And our descendants then are likely to say, it's told us, well, just they only need to wait 5 or 10 million years, they will be peeved. But at any rate, the point is that we will suffer a great deal in our economy, our productivity. We will suffer a very great deal in our environmental stability. And not least, and this I say with total sincerity, even as a secularist to my friends that I'm making now in the evangelical movement, a great loss in spirit. Bob?
I'm going to simply thank you and introduce Jeff Sachs to have him say something. I'm certainly not going to react in front of Jeff first.
Okay.
That would be wrong at every level, much as I have something to say.
Well, thanks so much. And I am here with my guru, who really has, he's inspired the world, but he's definitely inspired me and helped me understand these issues quite fundamentally. And one thing, watching Ed Wilson over the last 30 years, so many of the ideas at the beginning that were extremely controversial, poorly understood, highly contested, have proven to be really the defining path in a disciplinary way, including my own discipline of economics, because Ed said 25 or 30 years ago, starting with sociobiology, look to human nature and its deepest way to understand social organization and social behavior. And at the time, it was viewed by many as almost an anathema idea. Of course, it's become a very dominant part of the whole way that social thinking and economics in particular is now proceeding. For me, in addition to Ed's championship of our biological diversity and sane stewardship on the planet, a really pivotal idea that I would recommend to everybody is the idea of consilience, which I think is one of the most important ideas that we have available to us. And that was, of course, one of Ed's great books of the interconnectedness of knowledge. The jumping together was the basis of the term, but the interconnectedness of knowledge, and a research program and a conceptual program and a policy program, I would say, of drawing the linkages between the physical world, the biological world, the human social world, and the arts and the humanities. So it's as broad an integrative thinking as both an an analytical approach, but also an approach to good life and proper living. And I think that too is very much how we see the Earth Institute. It is trying to tie the connections of society, the underlying ecology, proper understanding of the physical processes on the planet, because without those connections, can't understand any of the particular pieces. We're talking about nothing less than the functioning of the Earth's life support systems this evening and the life on the planet and its survival in vast numbers of species. And it's probably useful to step back, at least for a moment, from an economic perspective, just to understand what's happened. Basically, the last 2 centuries have been utterly unprecedented in human activity and human effects on the rest of the Earth, other species, and the physical environment. We could do a lot of damage for a long time. Humans have a certain weed-like character in that they spread to all sorts of niches, and we were chopping down trees for a long time on this planet, so there was a lot of deforestation through history. But the scale of what is happening in the last 2 centuries is simply beyond anything that was experienced before and beyond our real understanding of what we're doing till now. Because no doubt there are some huge damaging trends that we're not even aware of, because we discover adverse aspects of human behavior frequently and by accident. And since we've only begun to plumb this area in a scientific way, there's a lot more learning to come. Essentially, the Industrial Revolution changed everything. It was a quantitative and a qualitative break with the past, because once it was understood how to use fossil energy, the ability of humans to do work of various sorts, whether it was work of clearing forests or work of clearing oceans or work of building cities and other wonderful achievements as well, took on an unprecedented scale. One of the things that the Industrial Revolution made possible was the ability to feed a lot more people. So when the Industrial Revolution started, the world's population was well under 1 billion people, maybe about 700 million, and it's roughly increased by 1 order of magnitude to 6.5 billion today. And given current trends of fertility behavior and demographic momentum, we're on our way to about 9 billion people by mid-century, at which point, mercifully, at least on current trends, there will be a leveling off of population on a plausible basis. Same thing happened in economic terms. While it's very hard to make serious comparative judgments about the levels of economic activity over a course of 2 centuries of the kind that we've had, the way that economists make these crude estimates suggests that the per person economic throughput has increased on average on the planet at least an order of magnitude, if not more. So what we're talking about is a 100-fold higher weight of human activity on the planet. And with 6.5 billion people and an average of about $9,000 per person of economic activity, translating into things like 25 gigatons, 25 billion tons of carbon dioxide emitted each year through this mobilization of fossil fuel and the deforestation that is adding to the carbon emissions. Our effects on every aspect of ecological systems is at a scale that is literally unsustainable and absolutely unprecedented, indeed unimaginable to most of us until one starts to systematically look and understand just what we're doing. Our capacity to clear vast parts of the ocean in a short period of time by nets that stretch for miles, our ability to clear-cut large parts of the rainforest, and of course, our ability to change the Earth's climate in a short period of time is truly beyond the understanding, not only of the White House, but of others as well. we have a serious, serious problem at hand. And I like to stress that if we did nothing more than to continue doing what we're doing, it is literally unsustainable right now, because on a current path, current levels, 25 gigatons of carbon emitted per year, carbon concentrations in the atmosphere rising 2 parts per million each year, we will pass thresholds of melting sea ice, of profound loss of species, as Ed said, and so forth. But that's not the world we're in. We're in a world where the pressures are going to multiply considerably in the coming decades, because India and China, understandably and rightly from my perspective as an economist, they want their chance in the sun, and they're going to get it because per capita income is rising.
In the smog.
Doubling, well, it's doubling every 8 to 10 years right now. In Asia, in China and India, it's a phenomenal rate of increase. Human populations are continuing to grow. And soon we will be at a scale of economic activity that might be fourfold what we have right now by mid-century. So the backdrop is that we've never seen anything like this before. We have no reference points. And when you're clearing forest or clearing biological systems, for a long time you might not see the impacts, because there's a large reservoir to tap into. When you're tapping into fossil water or fossil fuel, you might not see the impacts for a long time. When you're loading the atmosphere with greenhouse gases, you will not see the results for quite a long time, because biological sinks and physical sinks are rather large. But when you're doing it at the rate we're doing, and you start to see we're actually right now reaching critical thresholds, not in one way of doing things, but usually with 4 or 5 or 6 forcing events simultaneously, then you begin to understand the pressures that we're facing. If you say, what's happening to corals? They're being hit by every different direction, by acidification you can read about in the New Yorker this week, by longer-term climate change and warming of the oceans, by overfishing, by physical destruction of tourism, by many, many other processes. And this is true of just about every kind of stressor on the planet right now. It's multifactorial. The pressures are coming in so many different directions, and we have not yet figured out even a language of global communications about these issues that begin to meet the pacing and the severity of closing in on boundary levels. Now, let me make 2 more quick points. Believe it or not, we actually have global agreements to do something about these things. Actually, we have a wonderful set of international agreements on climate and on biological diversity and on species at risk of extinction and on degradation of drylands and so on, that if they were actually known and implemented, would make much of what we're talking about quite superfluous. For example, there is an agreement, and I'd ask how many people in the room have ever heard of it, that by 2010, the world has agreed that there should be a significant reduction in the loss of biological diversity. It is an international treaty commitment of a Convention on Biological Diversity that the world has agreed to since 2002, that by 2010 there should be a significant reduction in the rate of biological loss. Now, given that the President discusses this each day, I'm sure you've heard about this, right? The fact of the matter is, I doubt that 1 in a million even has a clue that that's been a topic of discussion, or there is a Convention on Biological Diversity. It's also striking to me that while we have debated Kyoto Protocol on climate change, and the White House has said we are not going to do this, or we're going to do this, and so on, that almost no Americans know that we have actually signed and solemnly ratified a convention that holds us and all other countries to the requirement of stabilizing greenhouse gas emissions to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference. In other words, that's not something we rejected to do. That's something that we signed, sealed, ratified in the Senate by none other than our president's father when he was president. And that's not a matter of choice, that's a matter of international law. Of course, doesn't matter in a way. So the starting point is that there are glimmers of understanding, and there are actually even legal instruments that have indicated the capacity of the world to understand and address these challenges. But we're going through a complete fit of profound negligence and a general disdain and disregard for taking seriously anything that we say or do in this area. Now, the last point I want to make is that while the forcings of population and economic development and so forth are powerful, and the current levels of economic activity are, as I said, literally unsustainable. And while there are tendencies for these to get worse, the paradox of all of this and the hope of all of this is that the solutions are actually remarkably inexpensive, shockingly so. They're practical and they're ignored. So in the area of climate change, we had a nice discussion in this hall last night actually about the strong evidence that for less than 1% of global income, there are technologies at hand to reform the energy systems of the world, to decarbonize them in effect, to a point where they're safe to use. And that can be done for less than 1% of world income, though the costs of continued climate change are going to be devastating of life and GNP and economic development. So the cost benefits are obvious. The point I've been making on extreme poverty with my colleagues at the Earth Institute and the United Nations is that serious analysis, really deep down serious analysis, shows that the costs of enabling the poorest of the poor to meet their most basic needs, also so that they don't have to mine their physical environment to the point of destruction just to stay alive, is well under 1% of the rich world income. And that would save millions of lives and do an enormous amount to save the physical environment as well. And finally, the costs of forthrightly addressing the loss of biological diversity in ecological hotspots, in reserve areas, or in avoiding deforestation, in buying out practices that are unsustainable and making them sustainable, is also a pittance compared to the costs. Ed has quoted $30 billion for one plan. Even, frankly, if it were 10 times that, the costs of doing this compared to the benefits that would accrue are phenomenal. Remember, we're in a $50 trillion annual world income. So 1% is 500 billion, and you're talking about 30 billion, maybe it's 50 billion, maybe it's 100 billion, it's a pittance. In other words, if we go down by continuing on this path, it's in a fit of profound negligence, nothing more. It's not because it's fated. All of those good technologies destroying the planet also make it extraordinarily low cost to save it, because we're real clever and have very powerful tools, but we just so far have not been able to apply them.
Thank you both. What I'd like to do to open a discussion among the three of us is to ask one only slightly involved question of both of you. And it begins with Jeff's reference to Professor Wilson's great, insightful, created word, consilience, the jumping together of all knowledge. The notion that all knowledge we accumulate in our mental worlds is, for some inexplicable reason, capable of interdigitating itself with neither gaps nor overlaps. And I'll make the following question. What we heard tonight, both qualitatively and quantitatively, amounts to a situation in which our species' impact has led to poverty, which is unforgivable, and will lead, unchanged, to collapse, which is irreversible. And as Jeff said, we do not have the language to bring those facts into consilience with the technology that could save us. That would be my observation from the statements of the two guys. And I'd like to raise the question to the both of you, what is that language that would bring these facts into consilience? I would simply say that right now the problem to me is defined by the fact that that language is available, but it is not inside the circle of consilience. It is the language of what is right and wrong, not what is possible and not possible. Not what can we do, which is brilliantly expounded by Jeff as a trivial cost and a great cleverness. Not what can we do, but what ought we do. I'm saying something that may seem obvious, but on inspection, the problem I see is that there is no evidence for the validity or reality of that question in nature. There is no right and no wrong in a living system, an ecosystem, a global planetary life emerging by the survival of DNA sequences greater capable of providing for the survival of the organisms they encode. As Francis Crick once said at a meeting I attended, all life is DNA's way of making DNA. In that world, the question of what's right and wrong does not gain consilience with those facts. And yet the question remains, and I think that is our door in, and so this is really a personal question to both of you. In the mental worlds of many people in this room, and I'm one of them, the answer to that question takes the vocabulary and language of a religion. And it is very clear to me that very few people would think that there is a religious part to the consilience of all facts of nature. Music, yes. Art, yes. But ritual, I don't think so. It's certainly not there by mocking the source of it if it's perceived as being a source outside of nature, because the question itself is not in nature. So given the fact that I'll bet when you're all by yourselves, you do as I do, hear in your heads the question, what ought I do, as opposed to what can I get away with? Have you not wondered where does that question come from, and how may you capture that question for these holy purposes?
Would you like to consider an easier question?
No. Nope. I'll take that as an answer.
No, don't let him get
I'll
away
have
with
to go
it.
on because I've wrestled with this one a lot.
I'll bet.
And I myself arrived at a vision of the origin of ethics, ethical precepts, and of moral reasoning, which is naturalistic, that is, materialistic. You probably knew you were going to corral me in this direction.
I did.
And therefore, I have a regard toward the rest of the world, the living world, as a conservationist and a biologist, that approaches absolutism. I'm an extremist. When we raise the question of can we have a triage and let some species go in order to be sure to save others, I say no, save them all. It should be like in an emergency room right now. We should be trying to save them all, because surely the efforts of 6.5 billion people can be focused like sunlight through a magnifying lens to save something like 10 million species. It can be done. And my reasoning, therefore, is what you would call anthropocentric, not biocentric. There are ethicists who say that species have rights and that we should adopt a biocentric viewpoint which provides rights to those species, and that we should do it in a somewhat legalistic manner in addition to making it part of our moral framework. I can't see it that way. I think this is what you're getting at. But I do see, fortunately, that, that the saving of the rest of the living world and of all these natural environments, in every way, from every direction, by every criterion at every level, shouts to us, we must save everything that we have inherited for our own sake as a species. And then we can go on from there and acquire idiosyncratic personal reasons for wanting to save it, a love of a particular place, which most humans have. They love certain places that they have become familiar with, that have given them sustenance and so on. And it mounts up to such a powerful force manifest in the way people are, their human nature, and what the future before us can be foretold along these scenarios mentioned by Jeff, that it reduces the question of the origin of our ethical reasoning to triviality for the short term. But now if you were to press me, I would then say, I do not think it necessary, and this may sound strange to someone who's just made an appeal to the religious community for their help, but I do not think it's necessary to go outside naturalistic explanations of the origin of humanity in order to understand our deepest emotions related to aesthetics or moral response, because I think that it is very easy to conceive of the human brain being hardwired to do good. That is, that altruism in the purest sense of the word could be hardwired into us. And if you say, well, how is that possible? Because of the Darwinian dilemma, that you cannot be altruistic in a society because altruists lose. You know, the genes of altruists are lost, and in a competition with the genes of selfish members of the society. But that's much more complex by that, in a manner foretold correctly by Darwin himself, that it's group against group. That group loyalty, group cohesion, sincere concern, willingness, as we see in every war, among Congressional Medal of Honor winners, and they always get the Congressional Medal of Honor for doing it and deserve it, to throw themselves on a grenade to save a group of unrelated men that they have become companions of. All these point to a powerful social instinct to do well and to show altruism. But unfortunately, this can be formulated in sound population genetic theory, how this originated. I happen to be working on it at the very time, worrying it through myself. But it does create a great social dilemma, political dilemma, and that is that groups tend to define themselves in opposition to other groups. And we fall into conflict with astonishing ease through suspicion, through economic competition, and so on. So a large part of the solution is to find the instruments of cooperation among nations that finesse the differences that inevitably rise, and see, try to funnel them and condense them and put them into the Olympic Games and soccer tournaments and so on. Whatever it takes to do it, but we will depend upon the instruments of international law and obedience to international agreements freely arrived at. Jeff is absolutely right. We have a book of international agreements now. They are workable. So now a good part of it, and I'd be glad to see religious thinkers take this on too, and however they reason it out, come to practicable solutions that can be mapped onto the practicable solutions of the secular scientist and political and statesman strategies to solve this great problem of achieving international peace on the basis of fundamental instincts of altruism expanded to include not just your local community, not just your own country, but also the whole world.
Jeff asked me to not moderate but also participate, and I'm very, very eager to respond, but it seems to me, notwithstanding, I should let Jeff go first.
I'll just make a couple comments. First, let me clarify something because I don't want to be misunderstood on an important point. You mentioned, that wasn't the point of your question, but in the prefatory part you said that we are a species that has led to intolerable poverty. That's actually not my understanding of it or my point. We are a species that has allowed unnecessary and intolerable poverty to persist in a world of plenty. Actually, what we've done quite remarkably is eliminate most extreme poverty on the planet. And economic progress, something I really believe in, and I do like economic development and think that it has led to vast improvements of human well-being, first measured by the more than doubling of life expectancy, which I take to be a very real part of a good life and a good global society. So we have not led to poverty. We are leading to impoverishment of the physical world, but it's not the poverty of the human side. Actually, it's one of our great triumphs. What's shocking is that we still allow people by the millions to die of poverty, even though it would be so trivial, in fact, to do something about it. And that's the point that I would turn to duck your question in a different way. Most of these...
So also an answer.
Yes, most of these issues, in my opinion, are mainly fits of absent-mindedness, neglect, and poor understanding, rather than struggles over values. My argument about extreme poverty is not so much about the rights and justice, though, of course, we have our views and I have my own, but about why the hell wouldn't we, for 100 different reasons that people may have, help a child have a $5 bed net to fight malaria? I mean, are we, almost any body of theory would embrace the need to do that. And I believe that most of what passes for struggles across values are actually arguments about facts that people don't understand. The facts that they're talking about are the real choices that we face. And so I do have to say that, I do feel, Bob, that values are important. We each have them, but we tend to fight over them rather than stepping back first and I'd say seeing how far we get on the description of the circumstances. Because in my view, the more clear the circumstances are described, 95% or more, and I'm obviously being a little flippant on the numbers, a huge proportion of what look like deep ethical issues melt away, in my understanding and experience, melt away just under the glare of what our true choices are, not what we believe our choices to be. I'll give one short example and then stop, a little bit different from this. One of the most impassioned articles that I read and one of the worst in 2002 or 2003 was a study by some ethicists about the lifeboat of the AIDS world and this terrible, terrible dilemma. Should we allocate money for prevention or should we allocate money for treatment? And it was the triage story. We have such scarce resources, and yes, it's the painful choice of who you throw over the boat. And it was written with such deep conviction and sympathy and anguish, and it was ridiculous because we're not in a little boat. We're on a super tanker. There's plenty of room for everybody, and the pills cost 30 cents a day. So do something else with your anguish. But there's plenty to do of both preventing and treating this disease, not having to anguish over it. And most of what we anguish over, should we do this or should we do that, is a misunderstanding that these are not powerful constraining choices. Why do we misunderstand? Because we're fearful, because it takes considered work to realize, because we're coming upon problems we've never seen before, because in the course of human history, we did not have experience in the savannah with understanding how the Industrial Revolution would work, so we're operating in uncharted, unprecedented territory where events are greatly superseding our ability to discuss these issues. And all of this is to say that I don't want to diminish the role of values that we each have and carry and use in our judgments and our actions, but it's not disagreements about values that will keep us from acting. It's, I think, a lack of a shared perception of what the real choices are.
So when Jeff and I discussed organizing this event for Professor Wilson's and everyone else's benefit, I thought to myself, how am I going to get these two guys to disagree when they actually agree? And now I understand that they disagree with me.
So far ahead.
So
that's why I'm sitting on this end.
That's right. Maybe it needs two of us to balance you.
Let me try and respond to both in one short response. Jeffrey gave me a wonderful opening to this response by saying, if you get past your absent, I'll rephrase it. I'm sure I'll get it slightly wrong, but I hope not intentionally wrong. The absent-mindedness and ignorance of facts emerges as a false notion of moral question, that given the facts, moral questions melt away. But it's the glaciers that melt away, not the moral questions. The fact is, I would say, that the beginning of each of your presentations is discordant and non-conciliant with the end of each of your presentations. You're not consistent. You're exemplifying the absence of common language. It is a disaster worth changing everything for, but it'll get better because it's hardwired to do so. I don't believe that. I think a redescription in a common language that we can use is that evil exists, that boundaries may be crossed by any human being, which when crossed generate avoidable human suffering. That these boundaries are not hardwired because free will permits them to be crossed. And so when they are not to be crossed, when we do, whether you call it Jeffrey's clarification of absent-mindedness or my choice of what's right, when you do fix it, as we must fix it, I ask again, given the fact that the answer from more than half the planet is from my religion, where else would you get your boundaries that have some hope of being sustained given the reality of the emergence of huge amounts of human stupidity generating human suffering? I can't imagine that you can simply say it's hardwired, but we haven't woken up yet. I think the problem is deeper. I think we have too much freedom, and that the only way to entrain ourselves against our freedom is to accept boundaries as if they were obligatory. Mine are obligatory out of a religious obligation. Where are yours obligatory from? That was the question. Duck it again if you want, but I'll just ask it a third time.
Okay. You don't believe in hardwired altruism?
I don't believe it can possibly be consistent with the mess we've gotten ourselves into as a species in the last 200 years.
I think Jeff explained that very well.
I guess I don't get an A.
Well, the thing is that, of course, I'm just saying that one does not have to be obedient or believe themselves to be obedient to a supernal outside judgmental force in order to obey and behave
Correct.
rightly. Okay.
By the way,
Okay,
I'm
so-
very careful to speak of myself as religious, and
Right. That's the usual way. You know, that's the primitive way that
I'm
we
happy to
tend.
be-
The law is set down before us. Usually, it's a law that was written by scribes in the midst of time, like the Old Testament, which was written by Iron Age the scribes for patriarchal dynasties in late Iron Age, was quite imperfect, but it was nonetheless what has tended to guide us in too many situations through the new world that we were creating. And to say that we may very well, I think there's plenty of evidence that it does exist, possess a capacity, a propensity to behave altruistically to others than our immediate relatives, does not say that in some way all we have to do is celebrate that and then proceed to world peace and doing all the great things that the Earth Institute has outlined for us to do.
then the Earth Institute can melt away.
In fact, I feel I can only repeat what Jeff said on this, as much as I'd like to disagree with him, because I'd like to provide some entertainment. But the thing is that it's ignorance, and it is neglect, and it is a willingness in the face of ignorance and neglect to kind of partition the world into good and evil, and you know which group has the good and which group threatens us with evil, and then to try to conduct ourselves in bringing the rest of the misguided world around to our particular, how should I put it, our particular transcendental view of morality. Whereas instead, we have the capacity, if we can clearly present the problems and to show what their consequences are if not solved. If we can find the way to make that clear to people, they will tend to come together on hope for its solution. And that then what you need is the way to present, to describe the fix for it. And I think science and technology have done excellent jobs in showing how to fix some of these problems. And then you have to ask the question to persuade people of all beliefs, in all backgrounds, of the validity of going forward in a united way. You have to tell how much it's going to cost. And we know that the cost is ridiculously low compared to our productivity as a species. And then finally, you want to tell them what they will gain by doing this, by fixing it. And I believe that when all those things are laid out in a manner that is objective, clearly defined, testable, we will then find the beginning of an era of cooperation, and maybe we will pull off these things that must be done. The most encouraging thing has been brought up by Professor Sachs, namely, it's not going to cost us an arm and a leg. We're not asking people and governments and groups and the corporate world to descend into a black pit of debt and discounting deeply all of the future for our descendants and so on. We're talking about chump money.
Well, clearly presenting the problem to people who see you as the problem, isn't it a good idea to listen first? I'm not being facetious. Yeah. What you say, let's say it was so, for the sake of argument, how can you expect to be heard yourself if you've detected that the problem is people are not hearing? why do you think that if they have something to say to you is the reason they don't want to listen, that can be discounted by simply presenting them with facts? Once you've diagnosed the problem as that the ears have walls, why do you think facts will get through them?
Let me.
Please.
Yes, I was going to say, I think it's time for him to answer.
Oh, yeah.
I was actually hoping to duck some of this, but I'm going to come in. Let me take an example where I think it's pretty crystal clear, maybe unfairly so, a case, and then try to make it more general. Take the case of the threat to the ozone layer from chlorofluorocarbons. I don't think there's any way, I would imagine, and I think you would agree, I don't think there's any way that one could characterize that challenge as a challenge of right or wrong or good versus evil. And what I mean by that is when chlorofluorocarbons were invented in the chemical industry in the 1930s, the great advantage seen by them is that they were supposed to be inert and very useful as refrigerants and aerosols. And then it was discovered quite accidentally, thank goodness, by Crutzen and Molina and Sherry Rowland, that actually they are active in the stratosphere and that they break down the ozone layer. There was nothing evil about it. It was just an unknown. In the best case, that was a case where the companies were able to come up with a cheap alternative pretty quickly, where NASA was able to take a picture of the ozone hole over Antarctica, and where the world got together and within a couple of years actually reached an agreement, let's do something about it. I cite that example as the clearest case of where it really wasn't a deep challenge of morality or ethics. It was a technical issue, actually, and a technical fix, which I rather like because we live in a technical age. And it was possible to move to a different technical compound, which didn't have the ozone-destroying atmospheric effects. I want to suggest, Bob, that a lot more of our problems on the planet are actually like that. That's an extreme case. But I think a lot more of our problems are actually like that. That we are in a technological age that has come upon us very, very fast. And we haven't really understood the margins of disaster. Now, yes, there's vested interest, there's deliberate misinformation, which I would not really like to put much favor on. But even with all of that, I wouldn't characterize this mainly as a problem of evil corporations destroying the environment or evil oil companies or anything like that. I would characterize it that we haven't figured out how to live consistently with ecological processes that even the ecologists have not really understood until the last 20 or 30 years, and where there still is a lot of uncertainty and so on. So it's not to say, and I really, I think it's not to say that anyone's values are right or wrong, but it just does seem to me to be a treacherous course to start on, to say that this is a problem of good versus evil, because that's a hard path, and the invocation of evil is, I'd say, a last resort in a way. And since I believe we're going to make the vast majority of headway without needing to do it, and where I see the invocation of evil, such as in the access of, being extraordinarily problematic and very dangerous, the way that these things do get invoked, I would like to find, and where I believe that there is no great religious tradition that is against the sane, basic measures. There's no religious compulsion which says we are commanded to destroy the environment. We are commanded to have climate change, or we are commanded to leave poor children to die. Given that, I'm rather confident we don't have to sort out those issues, given what a thorny path that has turned out to be. to actually solve a lot of this. And that's why I love Ed's book also, because that's what he's saying is, in the end, I'm writing a letter to you, Pastor. We don't actually reach the ultimate agreement, but you know, we reach the practical agreement utterly. And since I've said to my colleagues repeatedly, practical is my favorite word in the language, I'd stay there too.
I'm looking at the clock, and I'm thinking of my responsibilities to myself, to what I think is right and wrong, and to this audience. And I'll pass you the following observation by way of opening up the discussion in a moment to the audience. My favorite religious scientist, or scientist of religion, is William James, the author of The Varieties of Religious Experience, a group of 12 or 18 lectures he gave in the University of Edinburgh to a group of white men with turnaround collars. And he spoke there of his religious experience as data. And we know from medical records that he was what is today called a seriously clinically depressed man, hospitalized for that fact for much of his life. And his insight was that people like him were often the kind of people who were recognized in religious contexts as holy, saintly, prophetic. And so he wrote of the burden of understanding that data, that one must not judge a religious person by their manner, but by the consequence to the people around them of that manner. I believe he used the three descriptions to measure a person's religious quality as being able to generate in the people around him or her luminousness, reasonableness, and kindliness, which it seems to me is not far from what both of you are saying is the necessary prerequisite to getting past this terrible moment. Now, his summary of that notion is that of any religious experience, you should know it, as he said, by its fruits, not by its roots. And I believe that I can reach consilience with the two of you if you will agree with that notion.
Absolutely.
Okay. And with that, let's go to questions. I believe I see a red light, which means that it is question time. I can't see a thing, but there are people with microphones. If you raise your hand, one of them will come to you, and then you will be able to ask a question. I can't see what's happening, nor can anyone else. Please bring microphones to waving hands, those of you who can see. It's part of natural evil that I cannot control the lights.
I guess I'd like
Can we ask each person that asks a question to identify themselves?
My name
please?
is Peter Eisenberger. I'm a professor of Earth and Environmental Science at Columbia. I guess I'd like to ask your comments on the following question. You're sitting up there and talking which I tend to agree with, it's so plausible, all these things that we're doing wrong. Yet opinion poll after opinion poll in this country shows that nobody believes it. The environment is way down on any American's priorities. Global warming doesn't even register as a concern. And so it seems to me you have to ask the question, what is it about our message of such a plausible thing that is failing to communicate with the very people we're trying to reach? And I would suggest it has to do with this idea, the words you use, ignorant, misguided. We're trying to tell people there's something wrong with them. But that's the way it sounds. The environmental movement in general is claiming there's something wrong with the rest of us. We are the villains who are destroying the planet in the pursuit of our knowledge, right? And I would suggest to you also that the basic framework, I'd like your comment on this, is incorrect. The greatest threats is not to ourselves. The greatest threats is what's going to happen in Yellowstone National Park when it blows up and completely destroys our United States, which it's going to do, no matter what, it's going to happen. The greatest threat to us is that an asteroid is going to hit our planet in the future, as it has done in the past. And I would suggest, getting back to you, Professor Wilson, is the way to build cooperation is rather than talk about the things we're doing wrong, is to get us to focus on some of these external threats that actually makes the natural world something we've been trying to accommodate ourselves to with, something we really have not really come to peace with. Right. So my question is, how do you react? How do you react to that different reference frame, and wouldn't you think maybe one would have better success in getting people to come together to address the basic question of our relationship to nature?
That's addressed to me. I thought that's what we were doing. I thought that was the whole point of this discussion.
Yes.
I didn't see any sign. I don't see any suggestion in what we were saying that somehow we are identifying an other, a group of others who are doing something wrong. It's just that, nor do I see any sign in what we were saying that what we are doing is intrinsically evil or culpable. Quite the contrary, that it's us who are at fault, humanity as a whole, and that we are developing solutions and defining problems much more precisely, and it's a matter of getting it across. Now, why that has been so slow to take in the United States is a very interesting question, and I am now going to pass that on to my distinguished colleague on my left.
Yeah, I also want to say, Peter, that if I also used the language of ignorant or that was...
You're speaking of me, Peter. It's
No, I'm not speaking of... there was not a shred of an idea or intent to call someone a villain, to call someone stupid. What I do mean is that actually understanding the actual processes, the physical chemistry of CFCs and ozone, that's a measure of our ignorance. Understanding what happens as greenhouse gases increase, that's a measure of our ignorance. And there is, in that sense, a poor understanding of complex processes that were never known to be very important, especially when we weren't pushing against the margins. It's not blame, it's not attack, it is not about evil companies or villains or anything like that. It's not even about blame at all. It's actually, I think, trying to find practical solutions. See, I really do like that word. It's trying to find practical solutions to real problems that we can all agree, once we've looked together at these problems, as being serious and worthy of our attention on many different value bases. Some people would say it's our security, some people would say it's our religion, some people would say it's common sense, some people would say it's something else. I don't think this takes us to the core of our, as I said, our angst or our values or our competing visions of the meaning of life. I think it is actually more that the nature of our relation to the world is new, unprecedented, and fairly complicated if you haven't had an atmospheric science course recently. And we're blessed in this environment, we really are, with a lot of people like Bob Pollack or like you or other colleagues here that study these things and know them, and most people do not have the benefit of the latest assessment round of the IPCC and so forth. And it's not to denigrate anybody. People have busy lives and in a complicated world. It doesn't mean that we don't have a very serious problem at hand. Now, in terms of your empirical statement about the level of concern, I think it's wrong, actually. We were recently meeting with MTV, who told us that when they surveyed their demographic group, which is young people, environment is by far the #1 issue on their mind. And so I don't think that there is any sense in which there's a lack of interest in this. We've had cover stories on the environment regularly of Time and Newsweek in the past year, of The Economist magazine. We've had movies like Al Gore's movie, which is a documentary, after all, of a PowerPoint presentation that has been a best-selling movie. There is no lack of interest in this. There is a lack of enough shared understanding to have reached a consensus, and there's a lot of fear. And there is misdirection, which is how our public discourse goes, and we live in a very noisy environment as well, where there's lots of things being thrown at us all the time. that make it hard to focus on longer term and important issues. So I think it would be, I apologize if it was taken as an attack or even a critique. It's more a question of a problem-solving need that we have, and that, I think, is the main spirit of it.
Question? Somebody else? Thanks, Jeff. That was good. That's good.
I think that
You
Jeffrey
got to
Sachs.
say who you are, please.
Oh, yeah, I'm Donald Mandel. I'm at SUNY and at the Psychiatric Institute at Columbia. I think Jeff Sachs came right to the point of answering Bob Pollack's query, and then swerved away from it. Let me explain.
A little louder, please.
The emphasis on practical solutions that cost less than 1% of output may not be what people really want. Religion tells mankind to dominate the world. And so, you see, if one could ridiculously claim we should invent at great cost something that reproduces the natural cycles that keep nature in balance, the intricate relationships like Professor Wilson knows maybe of Callaway Dotson and Hugh Dressler. They studied orchids and bees in Ecuador and found that if they found a new orchid species, there would be a new solitary bee that was adapted only for that orchid, and so they were a nice team. Or long before there was an ozone problem, there was biodegradable detergents that were bubbling up all over, and so we didn't know enough about that and corrected it. That's one approach. But there is an approach which might in fact be promulgated by religious belief that says it's our business to really make nature our servant, to create what it is, our own cycles. Forget about the shock and awe of the tornadoes that hit Colorado, the tsunami. You know, we should be in charge.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, a microphone to the front. Peter Sanchez is waving his hand.
Yeah.
What? Alley to Peter.
Pedro Sanchez of the Earth Institute. When I gave a seminar in your series earlier this year.
Speak up.
Sorry. When I gave a seminar at the Center for Science and Religion earlier this semester, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. And it was on the issue of poverty in Africa and the things that Jeff is leading our work. Bob Pollack came back to me and says, "You're a religious person." Well, I don't go to any particular church or synagogue or anything like that. And he said it was a matter of the values that I was holding in terms of trying to help people and do it indeed in a practical manner, as Jeff Sachs. So I said, well, that's interesting. But then, when Jeff says, let's just be practical, and there are no evil people there, I think to a large extent there are a lot of ignorant people, and I agree with Jeff. But there's a line that has been crossed, and it's been crossed, quite frankly, by the Bush administration. Mm-hmm. I think there's a point in which it's not a matter of ignorance. It's a matter of ignoring what's blatant, what's been recommended to them. I think the Bush administration posture on climate change is the ultimate ostrich policy. And there's more to it than just ignorance. Is maybe not listening, but certainly they have had advice. I think there's a point in which the value of good and evil comes in, maybe in extremis.
Thank you. Somebody else, Cynthia? Somebody? Check is in the mail, Pedro.
Hello. Adam Black from Sustainability TV. Interesting comment about MTV before. With regard to the practical aspect and the ethical aspect, don't you think that there's the real issue of the way that the society, and in particular business, values values? Triple bottom line business thinking is in America in its infancy, and with regard to the political aspects that this gentleman was mentioning, I agree. We tend to get the governments we deserve. And we tend to get the processes in society that follow the investment rigor that we choose. I think it's something like less than 10% of American investment at the moment is in CSR companies. Chances are less than 10% of the investments of people in this room as actively trying to create value. And you guys, including myself, are people in this room. So my question is, this issue of ethics and communication and circumscribed belief, isn't it all defined by business motivations? Do not they score higher on the choice card than any other ethical value in this society at the moment?
We live in a market economy where self-interest has a very powerful role in directing resources, and where if you want to address these issues, we need collective choices being made. Understand that putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is first and foremost under the way that markets are organized, a free disposal from the private point of view. Not a matter of evil, a matter of treating a collective commons as a free disposal site. We know from economic logic as well as ecological logic that a free disposal commons is a pretty dangerous thing because it gets filled up and it has hugely adverse effects for all that live around it or beneath it. To do something about it requires a collective decision because nobody does own the air, not our companies or anybody else. It is a matter of collective decision making rather than individual decision making. And we understand that there are various kinds of policy instruments and mechanisms that can align private incentives and public incentives, such as tradable permits or a tax on carbon emissions or other techniques that have been successful in certain contexts like CFCs or like sulfur oxides and so on. Now, again, for most of these problems, our societies never had to think about them before. This is really the main point. Nobody actually really cared or even had to care what kind of CO2 they were putting up into the environment. It's a pretty low state molecule from an energy point of view, and it doesn't really matter except that it happens to wreck the climate. But before it was reaching the kinds of proportions that we have now, it wasn't doing anything particular. So no one had to care, and there was no reason for collective action around this. I would argue that while I don't admire the White House, and I do not on its policies on this and many other things, and I do not admire ExxonMobil for making a complete mess of this issue for many, many years until recently and deliberately obfuscating this issue, that is not the main driver of what's happening. The main driver of what's happening is an unprecedented level of carbon combustion of a sort we've never seen before in an intrinsic global commons of our atmosphere with effects that were not understood or modeled, even though, yes, scientific aficionados can understand that Arrhenius identified the effects in 1896, but it's really only the last 20 years that we've begun to understand in depth the implications of this. I can tell you it's going to be pretty complicated to get global agreements because there's a lot of hard stuff to make fundamental changes to the energy system. But describing this as villainy or describing this as good versus evil, in my opinion, is not going to accelerate the process. Rather, explaining the options on alternative energy sources, the low costs of a traverse into a sustainable energy system and so forth could actually get us to some really useful places that we are not on track to be on right now. To get there is going to require public understanding, not name calling. And again, the idea wasn't to call anybody stupid. My God, how hard you have to work to have some basic understanding of this. You really have to work hard, and it's not easy.
That's the point.
So the point is,
That's the point.
we got hard work to do in trying to share and discuss information to put forward real choices in real time with 6.5 billion people who all need to have their say and are going to have their say. And that's the nature of this problem. It's not going to be done by a private market. It's going to be done by collective action. It's going to be done by public agreement because it's about a public commons, our atmosphere.
Would you like to say something? Well, yeah, I would like, this is a fine statement and absolutely true, what one would expect from an economist. So I'm going to
my best.
I'm just going to add one more
Yes.
thing to that. I believe that one other aspect, I know you would agree with it, I think you would, but you can disagree if you want, is that one aspect that clearly appears to be hardwired universally in the human brain, associated somehow with tribalism, is a propensity to believe in something larger than itself and to respond positively to great goals that represent the collective activity of the group. So I think you have the core of the problem beautifully expressed, but perhaps we need to add to that an environmental moonshot or two. That is, I think the American public is reaching a tipping point on the understanding of the key issues of the environment that are, you know, the plainest in sight. It's true to understand all the reasoning behind them. So if you had to debate it among neighbors who wanted to take a divergent view, it would be difficult. But I think they're coming to, Americans are, as you said, coming to understand and care about the environment, especially the younger generation. And if we had the kind of leadership which we have not had and desperately needed at the highest level for the last 6 years, then I believe that we would have had a call to action, a moonshot, a My Fellow Americans speech that would say by 10 years from now, we will have achieved X% conversion to alternative energy sources. We will begin to free ourselves from the fever swamps of the Middle East. We will have re-achieved our independence as a nation, and we will have acquired benefits and a new vision of the future and a new hope for the future, which we have been sorely lacking because of the confusions and the contradictions and the clear evidences of a deterioration of our national welfare and existence.
Have you thought about running in 2008, Ed?
No, but I'll be glad to help out with speech writing if you will join me, Jeff.
I'm given a schedule in which it very clearly says that I'm to make closing remarks, and I will keep them very brief. I am pleased to be the student of both these guys, and I think I can say the following as their student. Now that we all agree, and I agree with both Jeff and Professor Wilson, that now it is time to care about the processes and the facts of nature, that the free ride we've gotten until this decade is over. Now that we can agree on that, then I would say the processes and facts of nature need to be understood first and foremost by those hundreds of millions of our fellow Americans and hundreds of millions of people around the world, billions around the world, who say to themselves and to others that they are motivated by their, what may be to you irrational, certainly undemonstrable religious convictions. The deeper the religious motivation, the greater the necessity to teach these facts. And that, as I hope you'll see tonight, is precisely the mission of the Center for the Study of Science and Religion in the Earth Institute. That said, before I ask you all to thank my two guests, I remind you that on that way out upstairs, you can purchase Ed Wilson's book, and then you can go downstairs and find him ready to sign it. What could be better than that? Thanks.
Thank you.